This is Deborah Atkinson. Welcome to the Flipping 50 show, where I address your top questions and the things you struggle with most so you can have more energy and less decision fatigue about what to eat, how to move, and you can change your thoughts so you can flip 50 and have the life and the energy you love in the second half. My guest today is Dr. Evan Hirsch. Dr. Evan, as he is affectionately known, is one of the nation's leaders and authorities on chronic fatigue. He suffered with chronic fatigue for 5 years until he achieved resolution using the Fix Your Fatigue program that he pioneered in his medical practice, the Hirsch Center for Integrative Medicine in Olympia, Washington. He has helped hundreds of people resolve their chronic fatigue and is now on a mission to help 100,000 more through online courses, a book, a blog, and the training of other practitioners. He's lectured nationally and internationally on topics in integrative and functional medicine and is board certified in family medicine and integrative medicine. When he's not at the office, you can find him singing musicals, playing basketball, traveling, dancing hip hop, and spending time with his wife and daughter. And I cannot wait to dig into a little more about that hip hop. And welcome, Dr. Evan Hirsch.
Thank you, Deborah. Thanks so much for having me on.
So before we dive into the chronic fatigue, because I do want to hear your story, it's always so interesting to hear how somebody arrived at what it is they get up in the morning to do and feel passionate about. But tell me a little bit about your background. So singing musicals, dancing hip hop, you got a lot of right brain and left brain going on over there.
I do. I've always loved music, and yeah, singing is just kind of my bliss. And if I could make it on Broadway, I probably would do that. Yeah, I just love it so much, and I love dancing. And we'll push away the furniture and have a dance party at home with my 8-year-old, and it just really fills me.
You are going to be the hot dad. Maybe you already are. I don't know, but that's pretty cool. I love that. All right. So now share a little bit about your chronic fatigue story. And I think we have to say, the elephant in the room is, quite frankly, we hear this a lot from women. I hear it a lot from women in my community. I'm sure you're listening. You flirted with it, wondering what that is. Am I there? Or you have a friend who has. And yeah, I've heard very little of it from the male community. So tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I went into residency, I really didn't know much about fatigue. Fatigue was kind of a wastebasket term, as we call it, where you can't really figure out what's going on. You've tried a bunch of things and you haven't had success, so the person has fatigue. And then there's a number of criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But so I went into my residency program in Olympia, Washington. The University of Washington has a family medicine residency program down here. And I met my wife about a month in, and she was awesome. She was vibrant and beautiful and just amazing, and I fell in love with her. But her energy wasn't great, and it started to get worse. And after we were engaged, just a few months later, it started bottoming out, and she went to see a naturopath, and the naturopath diagnosed her with adrenal fatigue. And her adrenals were really cashed. I mean, she was flatlined on her cortisol levels, which is the main hormone that the adrenal glands produce that gives you your get up and go. Mm-hmm. And so there wasn't a lot of resources at that time. She read James Wilson's book on adrenal fatigue. She saw some naturopaths. She changed her diet. She bought a sauna for the house, and she used that. And slowly and surely she got better, but it took about 3 years. And then I finished residency, which was incredibly stressful for me. And then I started a business, had a child, and then I got fatigue. And I was just kind of pushing through it. I thought it was just leftover from residency where I wasn't getting a lot of sleep, working 80 hours a week. And I just had the worst brain fog. I could only see patients for about 4 hours a day, and I would do admin the rest of the day. And it was just a struggle every single day to get up, to go to work, to have enough brain power to solve people's problems, and then to come home and crash. And I'm a pretty bad patient. So that's changed. I shouldn't speak of that, right? I was having challenges taking care of myself. I was putting everybody else before myself. And so I was just kind of pushing through. Now, I had already had an interest in holistic and integrative and functional medicine. And so when I came out of residency, I put up my shingle and I attracted a lot of people who couldn't be helped by the conventional community or the naturopaths in the area. And so I was getting the sickest of the sick. And a lot of those folks had fatigue. So I started reading more about fatigue. I read Fatigue to Fantastic by Jacob Teitelbaum, which was a wonderful book. And then I started to fill in the gaps beyond that and beyond the functional medicine training that I had received. I went to the American Academy of Environmental Medicine to learn more about mold and about Lyme. I did some extra trainings on infections and totally started seeing these transformations in my practice. These people who had fatigue were getting better. And finally, it dawned on me, hey, you've got fatigue. You really need to start treating yourself. So I finally started treating myself and had this amazing turnaround. And so, one of the most challenging things for me is when somebody comes into my office and they say that their physician didn't believe them, that the physician kicked them out of the office or kicked them out of the practice because they couldn't help them. The ego of the physician is so big that because they can't help this person, they can't have compassion for this person.
That's scary.
It's totally scary. And I just feel for those people. So I'm on a mission to help 100,000 people. And, probably in 5 years, it's going to go up to 1 million or 10 million or whatever my vision is. But help 100,000 people resolve their chronic fatigue because I've got the tools to do it. And I really want to help as many people as possible.
What a phenomenal story. So I've got a couple questions for you. So tell me this. So it is chronic fatigue now, is it more of a problem or is it that we just now are seeing it come out and so it's more recognized and acknowledged, or both?
No, it's definitely more of a problem now. And a lot of it is because as we get into the causes, you'll see a lot of it has to do with environmental toxicity. So it's all the crap that we're exposed to in our everyday lives. It's the increase in stress. It's the news. It's, everywhere you look, there are things that are stressing your life. And we don't have really good tools on changing how we interact with stress, in addition to all these toxicities that are draining our adrenal gland, that are making all of this stress worse, that are causing us to, the body, this is pretty much a protective mechanism. So the body is trying to shut itself down because of all of the problems. It's trying to preserve itself.
Trying to curl up in a ball under the covers. Yeah. Okay, so let's hit it. So let's talk about the causes, especially in our audience. So a midlife woman or older, anywhere in that second 50, what is it? What are the causes of fatigue?
Absolutely. So sometimes people come to see me who are around 50 who have been fatigued for a long time. So I'm going to talk about those people first, and then we'll kind of dive into those people who turn 50, start to go through perimenopause, and then have fatigue. Does that work?
Perfect.
Cool. So this is going to be a bit of an extensive list. So just I'm going to talk about like 17 to 20 things.
Wow.
But yeah, and that's the reason why it's been so hard for people to get help with chronic fatigue, is because it's not just one thing. And this is why the scientific method also doesn't work, and the research is not working, is because you can't take one thing and treat chronic fatigue, because usually it's a combination of 10 to 20 things that are all happening at the same time. And so you have to address them all. Now, the highlight is that you remove all the crap out of the body and you replace the body with all of the nutrients and hormones that it needs in order to function right. And everything works just fine. So it's a very simple yet complex process, right?
Right. Yeah, sounds really easy. And then I have an idea. There's another step there in the instruction book.
Exactly. So the first cause is sleep. any sort of sleep dysfunction, if you're not getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, if you're snoring, if your partner is snoring, if you're not dropping into deep sleep, and all this stuff does get worse with perimenopause. Progesterone is the hormone that allows mostly women to fall asleep, and estrogen helps them stay asleep. So oftentimes, if a woman comes into my office and says, my sleep is awful since I hit perimenopause, I can't fall asleep. So then oftentimes we'll want to boost their progesterone. Or they'll come in and they'll say, I wake up at 3:00 every morning or every night. So then oftentimes we're going to want to give them estrogen. And we always want to give them estrogen with progesterone. And we always want to use the smallest amount possible. I'm not about bringing people back to when they were 20 years of age. We want to bring them back to, 5 years before, when things were working all right. We want to just use the minimum amount that's possible. And that's the way to do bioidentical hormones safely. So that's sleep. And then...
And I want to just emphasize for listeners, that's the first time, Dr. Evan, that I've heard that before said just as you said it, that progesterone helps you fall asleep and estrogen helps you stay asleep.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Okay.
Yeah. So then hormones are the next thing. So that we're talking about thyroid, we're talking about the adrenals, and we're talking about sex hormones. So we talked a little bit about the sex hormones with sleep, but then there's also testosterone, having an effect on your libido. So if you're perimenopausal or postmenopausal and you don't have great libido, it's probably because the testosterone is low. And that can also contribute to, a lack of muscle mass. So if you're working out a lot, can't build muscles. It also helps with decision making. So it's beyond, it's beyond just looking good and having a sex drive. You
Right.
can also really step into your job and be able to make decisions in a very healthy way. But you don't.
I like to say it's good for the boardroom and the bedroom.
Absolutely, yes. And the adrenal gland, just to mention that a little bit, adrenal glands are little triangular glands that sit on top of the kidneys and produce a number of things. They do produce sex hormones when the ovaries go quiescent, during perimenopause and postmenopause. So the adrenals are supposed to pick up the slack there. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But those adrenal glands produce cortisol as its main hormone, which regulates so many things in the body. It regulates all of the other glands, so the thyroid as well as the ovaries. It regulates the relationship between the brain, the hypothalamus and pituitary, and the rest of the body. It regulates blood sugars. It decreases inflammation. So it's super incredibly important. And then it also gives you that get up and go in the morning, as well as your circadian rhythm. So this concept of you're supposed to be awake during the day, you're supposed to be asleep at night. So when people have adrenal or cortisol issues, oftentimes they're kind of tired during the day, and then they can't fall asleep at night because the circadian rhythm has been disrupted.
Hear that quite a bit, yes.
So that's the hormones. And then there's infections. So I never thought that I would be dealing with so many infections when I entered my practice, but Epstein-Barr and cytomegalovirus and Lyme disease and all of the Lyme disease co-infections, all of these infections, we're just seeing just a huge increase. And a lot of that has to do with, the cortisol. I don't think I mentioned this, but cortisol also regulates the immune system. So if there's some sort of stressor, whether it's a physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, energetic stressor that stresses the adrenal glands, causes the cortisol to be compromised, the immune system won't be able to keep all of the bugs in the body in check. So it's not necessarily that we're getting new infections. Oftentimes, these are infections that we all have that are in our body that we live with symbiotically, synergistically. We're just friends. But then what happens is the immune system can no longer keep them in check. It gets distracted. And then the infections kind of take hold and they have a party, and we're the worse for it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Next is nutritional deficiencies. So this is B12, folate, vitamin D, iron. And little tip is that all of those nutritional deficiencies make have a huge effect on your sleep. So I actually get more people to sleep by giving them all of those things in the morning, in addition to thyroid and adrenals, than I do by giving them anything at night.
Wow.
And it's all because of this circadian rhythm concept.
So talk a little bit about those nutrient deficiencies. We addressed that quite a bit in the 28-day Kickstart program, the Flipping 50 program. And so talk to me, by the time a woman is in her 50s, and, we've lived in this lifetime. If you're 50 and over, you kind of went through the era where the belief was if you eat well, you don't need a multivitamin. You're just flushing that down the toilet. And then we've switched, we've changed. But a lot of women still have grown up with that idea and really haven't shaken it yet. So they may not be supplementing. And even though we all may try to eat as healthfully as possible, we can't possibly eat all those nutrients.
Right.
So
Yeah.
is that a long-term problem that's kind of become cumulative for us?
Absolutely. And there's a couple of causes. I mean, I totally wish we could get everything from the ground, from the
Real
food. I
food.
mean, that's what we're supposed to be doing.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
But unfortunately, because of runoff and because the nutrients have been taken out of the soil, we're no longer getting a lot of these nutrients into our bodies. Because of some of the drift from, even if you're getting organic food, there is still some drift from the non-organic farms over to the organic. Doesn't mean not to eat organic, because it is still the best for you, but you're just not getting your nutrients from that. And then you add on stress, and nothing shuts down digestion faster than stress. So all of these things that I'm talking about that cause stress on the human body will shut down that digestion, and then you won't digest or absorb those nutrients that you're trying to get from your organic food.
Great. I'm really glad you said that. And I know, as simple as that sounds, I think it bears repeating. So even if we're eating those nutrients, we're taking them in, our body may not be absorbing them. So it's not going to the good of our body and our health, correct?
Absolutely.
All right.
So that's nutrient deficiencies. So then the next one is lack of exercise. Now, this is an
Amen. I did not pay him to say that. Okay, y'all?
So now this is, we had a little bit of a conversation about this before, about how sometimes not doing exercise or doing exercise can be too hard on the body and you have to wait. And so,
right.
With a lot of my patients who have chronic fatigue, I do not recommend that they exercise until they get their energy up to about 80% of ideal.
Yeah.
Because when you exercise, it can be too stressful on the adrenals. So you have to make sure those are strong first before you exercise. But once you're at that point, to get to the next level, you have to exercise. You have to start moving. There is, if there is one panacea, a cure for everything in this world, it is movement and exercise.
Love that. Oh boy. Okay. So quote of the day. I just got my little social media meme today. I once had a client say this, and I kissed her right on the spot. I was like, I could not have written that any better. But she just said this, and she happened to be filming a television commercial for the program I was running. And she said, I don't care what the question is, the answer is exercise. And she was in her 60s. And so it was perfect. But I totally agree.
Yeah, it's truly amazing, all of the research that's on exercise, and time and time again. And it just has to be, I'm sure you talk about this, it has to be fun. For me, it's dancing.
Right. Yeah. I call it the joy factor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for everybody, there's a sliding scale of where your personal sweet spot is. I think some of us need more exercise. Some of us could do with less. and they're nodding out there. I know some of them. And I do think you've got to find where is your ideal.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So next up is chemicals. So pesticides, herbicides, Roundup, glyphosate. So there are 80,000 chemicals that are dumped into our products and our food every single year, and we are just totally toxic. There was a study done a number of years ago up in Seattle where they took fat biopsies. And they showed how toxic the number of chemicals that we have. There have been studies on breast milk showing that there's 200 different chemicals that are found in breast milk and in umbilical cord blood. And it doesn't mean don't breastfeed your kids, because you absolutely have to do that if you can. But it's just an illustration of how toxic our world is. And all of those things gum up all of the different process that we have. One of the next causes of fatigue are mitochondrial dysfunction, which is phase 2 detoxification of the liver. And, if we were, 3 million years ago, if, we had no problems detoxifying, but now we have huge problems because the heavy metals and the chemicals, they all gum up the system. And now we're getting just like this overburdening, this total body load that ends up triggering autoimmunity, causing fatigue, among others.
Wow, I'm still floored. I think I'm still stuck. My mind is reeling with this 80,000 chemicals dumped into our foods. And, I know that there's a temptation, I think, probably for listeners to be thinking, well, I'm really careful about what I eat. But even if we are really careful, we're still vulnerable in today's world. Are we not?
Absolutely. Everything, things that we inhale, every single fragrance, well, no, I shouldn't say every single fragrance, but most fragrances, have chemicals in them that are just toxifying the liver. Cosmetics, there was a study done, I think it was 70 or 80% of all lipsticks have a significant amount, a toxic level of lead in them. Mm-hmm. That we're just applying onto our body. So I highly recommend that all of your listeners, if they haven't done so yet, go to Skin Deep. I believe that it's
Yep. Yeah.
I can't remember the exact website, but if you Google Skin Deep, you can find where there are studies or testing that has been done on all these products, and you can find the least toxic cosmetics around.
Yeah, great. And listeners, if you're wondering about that, I will look that up for you. I'll put it in the show notes. Thanks for mentioning that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Next is constipation. So, we want everything to be functioning normally. You got to take in your food, you've got to digest it, and then you've got to be able to excrete. And if you can't excrete out the stool, out the urine, you're going to out the liver, you're going to start excreting out the skin with sweating. Then you can't get out all these toxins. So if you're constipated and you're not stooling at least every day, ideally twice a day, then you're just recirculating all of these toxins. They're getting reabsorbed through the gut back into the body.
I'm so glad you brought this up. This is a question that it doesn't come up often enough. And, when I start working with some of my groups, I'll have them journal, and we'll talk about, we're going to talk about the poop. I mean, it's important. So tell us a little bit more. I mean, the obvious is hydration. So drinking enough fluids and waters. I'll tell you a little story as a side note. My mom is now 90. And she was telling me, she was having a little trouble with constipation. And so it's becoming, she doesn't want to travel as much anymore. And the way she was talking kept assuming it was diarrhea. And she says, no, it's not that. And I said, well, tell me a little bit more. And have you talked to the doctor? Well, yes. And then I probed some more and I said, well, how much water are you drinking? Oh, gosh, I drink a couple glasses every day. I said, Mom, you're not constipated, you're dehydrated. I said, I want you to increase your water and then let's talk again. She called me back and she thinks I'm Einstein. She's like, I think you solved the problem. I said, did your doctor not ask you that? Did he not ask you that? So, but let's talk about what else is there. I mean, aside from, increasing fiber together with increasing your hydration and stress, I mean, what else is causing more constipation lately or recently?
Absolutely. So, one of the big causes is food allergies.
Really? Okay.
And the big one is dairy. So, what's interesting is when you eat gluten or wheat products, and when you eat dairy, is that they turn into morphines in the gut. There's called gluteomorphines and
Okay.
caseomorphines for the main protein in dairy. And morphine slows down the transit in the gut and can cause constipation.
Wow. Okay.
So that's a big one. Another one is lack of exercise.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to be able, even if people can't do much, if they can just jump around, if they can do, jumping jacks to get the lymph moving, to get the stooling moving, excretion moving. So that's another one. And then, magnesium is a mineral that performs 550 different enzymatic reactions in the body, and including transit through the stool, through the intestines. And it's also a huge mineral that's involved in support of the adrenals. So once again, if you are stressed and you require more magnesium that's going to be shunted to the adrenals to help the adrenals, then the magnesium is not going to work on the smooth muscle in the body, which is blood vessels. So oftentimes people have high blood pressure when this happens, and this is part of the reason why people get high blood pressure when they're stressed. And it will also not relax the smooth muscle in the intestines, and so that they end up contracting and constricting, and they don't allow for the stool to pass through.
Thanks so much for clarifying that. That's a great distinction. So talk to me a little bit about the daily recommendation for magnesium, or minimum, is 400 milligrams, I believe. Mm-hmm. So do you have a starting point when you see people, or does it vary dramatically? And would you rather I don't back you into that corner?
You can ask me any question you want, Deborah.
Okay.
So I love practicing personalized, individualized medicine. And so I'm a big fan of the subjective experience of the patient. And I start with magnesium. It's really what we call bowel tolerance. So how much your bowel can tolerate. Yeah. So I'll start people off sometimes at 250 milligrams, sometimes at 500 milligrams. And I'll have people ramp up I'll have them just take it at night because it also helps with sleep.
Yep.
And I'll have them increase every 3 nights by 1 capsule, or by 250 milligrams, let's say, until they get to the point where they're stooling twice a day. If you overshoot, then you get a little bit of diarrhea, but then you can just back off. Now, some people will start right away and they'll, increase every single day, but there's this delay between when you take it and when it affects your intestines. And so oftentimes if they take it every day, they end up overshooting, they get diarrhea, they're not too happy with me. So we increase every 3 days.
Yeah. That's kind of when the shit hits the fan, huh?
Literally.
Every once in a while, we have to throw a comic in. Okay, so question on that. I just want to clarify. So the type of magnesium, is that important?
It is. Well, yes and no, I should say. Magnesium citrate is the one that's most often used in conventional medicine. It can be kind of hard on the gut. I prefer better absorbed magnesiums, like magnesium chelates. And they come in a number of different forms. Glycinate is the form that I prefer, but there are some other ones. But those you'll have better absorption before you end up getting the bowel tolerance effect or the laxative effect of it. So you'll absorb more before you get that effect.
Okay, fantastic. Great.
Yeah. All right, so moving right along here. So I touched on this for a moment, but heavy metals. So heavy metals really are ubiquitous. This was a study in 2013, but 100,000 100,000 pounds of mercury were dumped into the environment. And every single coal plant produces mercury vapor. So I'm going to give everybody some bad news right now, and I hope you don't all hate me for it. But all of these, the fumes go on and settle down into our oceans. And now it's incredibly challenging to find any seafood whatsoever that does not have significant amounts of mercury.
Oh, yes. You just ruined my day.
I know, right?
Ah,
And so, in the bigger the fish, the more mercury.
yeah.
So unfortunately, tuna and halibut and even like king salmon. I mean, I'm up here in Olympia, Washington, and we've got all this wonderful
Right.
wild caught stuff, and you just have to try to limit it. What I do is I will consume sardines
Mm.
because they're smaller fish. My wife makes this awesome sardine fish, like tuna fish salad sort of thing, where you mix it up with garbanzo beans and then you put in your pickles and whatnot, and it tastes great. I mean, it tastes very similar. I grew up on tuna fish, which is why I have a ton of mercury in my body besides heavy metal, besides mercury amalgams. But it's just you just have to minimize it, and oftentimes if you're going to combine it with some sort of detoxification, like either exercise or sauna, or I like to use zeolites to bind up the heavy metals. I will do that after I consume a seafood meal. The EPA, which is a very conservative organization, has even decreased its recommendations for tuna fish to the pregnant woman. So it started off with, 1 can a day, and then it went to, 1 can a week. And now it's not even recommended if you're pregnant.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always take that as, okay, should the rest of us be doing that?
Right.
Right. So, okay, I've got a question about heavy metals. So I think this is okay, now we know, but how do we know? What are the signs and symptoms that I've got a heavy metal issue? Or is this by process of elimination?
Yeah, it's really challenging. I mean, there are some overt symptoms. Oftentimes people will have neuropathies. So they'll have numbness and tingling in the hands and feet.
Mm-hmm.
They'll have fatigue. They'll have brain fog. They'll have, there's a huge correlation with heavy metals and Alzheimer's. So and Alzheimer's really is just like a huge toxic soup, where heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections all play a role in turning on these genes, which end up causing Alzheimer's. So, but it's hard to know until you test, and because a lot of those symptoms that I mentioned can also be caused by a number of these other things that I'm talking about.
Right, right. Yeah, I was looking at my checklist here. I was thinking, okay, but what about that? But what about that?
Right.
All right. So, tell me a little bit about the test. I mean, is that something that typically a doctor will recommend, or do you need to be educating yourself and you need to be listening to this, thinking, everything else I've been eliminating, that's not it. Should I go test? How do I know? And tell us a little bit about that test.
Absolutely. So the test that we do is the same one recommended by the Mayo Clinic. It's a pre and post provocation test, or chelation, provocation, chelation. So basically, you wake up in the morning and you check your urine. So this is a urine test.
Okay.
And the reason why we want to do this is because we want to measure what's in the blood, but we need to also measure what's in the tissues. So the tissues, your organs, are the places where you end up storing these heavy metals and chemicals. And so you have to pull them out first in order to determine whether or not you have them and what the total body load looks like. So you wake up in the morning and you urinate, and that's just measuring what's in the blood. Then you take a chelating agent, which is Latin for claw, because it binds to things, right? And that could be EDTA, DMSA, zeolites. I mean, there's a number of things that are used, and those will bind to the tissues, or bind to the heavy metals in the tissues, pull them out into the urine, and then you collect that urine for 6 hours. And then when the test comes back, you compare the results. So this is what's floating around in your blood, and this is what was pulled out of your tissues into your blood.
So then is there a range? This is safe. This is really chronic and alert, red flag, or how is that treated?
There is, but it's also subjective. So if there's been, and there's also a comparison. So sometimes somebody won't end up in the red range, let's say, but the increase from the pre to the post is 10 times normal. So that's a really significant increase, but it may not be into that upper level. So, everybody's an individual. I would still chelate. I would still try to get out their heavy metals if they have 10 times normal, even if they're not necessarily in the quote unquote abnormal ranges, because there's research that's been done, but, who's to say? I mean, a lot of it depends on your detoxification processes. So let's say you and I both take a certain amount of mercury and you detoxify better than I do. I'm going to have more symptoms from the mercury than you will. And so we have to take all of that into account when we're determining whether or not we're going to treat.
Got it. And how long does that take?
So there are some caveats to this. I mean, there are some people or some practitioners who will chelate and treat for several months. I am concerned, and I've seen problems with being too aggressive on this, because you'll get redeposition, which basically means you're pulling it out of the tissue into the blood, and then it goes right back in someplace else. And I've seen some people get worse when you do it this way. So I'm a fan of going slow. I'm a fan of going slow on most things. The body likes slow changes. Mm-hmm. And so I'll do it over a year, and about 80% of my patients will have complete resolution of their heavy metals after that year. Now, what's really interesting is that depending on the chelating agent that you use that's binding up and pulling out, they will have different binding coefficients. So some of them will bind initially to lead, and they'll get all the lead out. And then they'll go after mercury, and then they'll get all the mercury out. And then they'll go after nickel, and they'll get all the nickel out. So doing a test part of the way through, it may look like, oh my gosh, why do I have more lead? Or okay, my lead's gone, but why do I now have mercury?
I see.
And it's because they have these specific binding coefficients where they bind to certain metals preferentially before the next one.
Got it. So over the course of a year, if you're treating someone, and I suppose this depends on how chronic or how toxic their level was, but how soon before someone begins to feel better?
It really depends. So a lot of times it can be pretty darn quick. That only after a few months. But you have to remember that we're also improving detoxification panels, our pathways. We're also going after all of these other causes, because if you have heavy metals, they've probably hijacked the immune system, and you also have infections. There are certain infections that feed off of these heavy metals. Candida or yeast is a big one, where they're really bound together and they feed off of each other. So you have to separate them and say, go to your respective corners and stop misbehaving. Right?
Got it. That's clear. Everybody got that. I totally got that.
So okay. It is this, you got to go after it all. You can't just go after the heavy metals and expect that everything's going to resolve.
Got it. So it's an integrative process, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So what else other than heavy metals and this long list we're accumulating?
Right. So mold, which is a huge problem and not very well understood still, and totally nebulous and controversial. So half of the buildings in our country have water damage. Ugh. Yeah. And so I'm just full of good news today, aren't I?
I know, right? You're a real downer. No wonder you hip hop dance.
That's right. That's funny. So, but the good thing about talking about these things is that once you figure out what the cause is, because that's what people are searching for. They're like, why
Yeah.
do I feel like crap? Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so once you can find the cause, then you can do something about it. So there's nothing that I test that we can't do something about. So yes, half of the buildings in this country have water damage. And it's because of the particle board and the drywall. I mean, it all just kind of feeds it. And all you need is the water damage coming from either a busted pipe or a leak or a leak in the roof. So those are kind of, or a flooded basement. So those are kind of like the big ones. And once the mold comes in, it's really hard to get it out. And so then it starts producing mycotoxins or mold toxins, gets into our bodies and compromise our immune system, our mitochondria, which is the energy center in every cell in the body, our brains. So, so it's a big problem, and it's one that people can go their entire lives without knowing that they had because a person didn't ask about it. But oftentimes those people will report, they're really good at smelling mold. So they'll walk into a place and they'll be like, whoa, I can totally smell the mold in this place. And the person with them will say, I don't smell anything. And it's because they've got mold in their sinuses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it totally triggers them. The other thing is that they will have neuropathies once again, so numbness and tingling in the extremities. They'll have brain fog. They will have yeast-like symptoms because mold is a fungus. And so they will have itching. They will have rashes that look like yeast rashes. I've had patients who've had their sinuses just, so full of it that they just get a lot of copious excretions. They're just producing a lot of mucus. So, so it's definitely something that you want to get assessed and looked at.
Wow. Yeah, definitely. And I can totally relate to your saying some people can walk in and smell it. And I've had people tell me that. And then in relaying their story, they're saying, the person I was with or my significant other thinks I'm crazy.
Exactly. Well, and that's a huge problem because usually it's the woman who is affected by it because of certain HLA genes that makes them more susceptible. And the man says, I have no clue what's going on. And it totally tears at the relationship because then the woman doesn't feel heard and the man thinks that the woman's lying. And it's awful.
Mm. And we don't need any more of that.
That's right.
Right.
So should we move on?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Is there
Please.
more? Is there more?
For the love of God, move on. Only a couple more.
Though, while you're doing this list, I hope listeners are feeling the same because there is actually a little bit of relief in knowing this is not just me. This is, if you have a problem, you're listening and thinking, there are numerous reasons why this could be happening to me. It's not in my head. I live with these kinds of things all the time. And I do think that women, all of us, I think we're all intuitive. Some of us tap into it more than others. And you've probably gone down this list. And if you're listening, you are recognizing, I wondered about that, or I think that, or that's the one. I really know I need to ask more about it. So I can really appreciate that you're potentially providing some questions, the right questions, if not the right answers for all those listeners.
Absolutely. I mean, I just hope to empower people so that they can take this information, go into their physician and get them thinking about it if they don't understand, or we can talk about where they can find doctors like me, who can coach you in this, who can take you through this process so that you can achieve the best health of your life.
Great.
So I'll talk about two more, and I'll just be quick on it so we can move on. One is psychological state, emotional state. So emotional traumas, so post-traumatic stress disorder, or even ACEs, adverse childhood events, which is what I call PTS as opposed to PTSD, so post-traumatic stress. So these stressors that changed us changed our thought patterns, that we were not worthy, that someone told us once upon a time that we weren't attractive, or that we were not good enough, and so we have these thought patterns in our brains that are totally stressful on our body that, cause fatigue as well.
Wow, that's powerful.
Mm-hmm. And they have to, I talk about in my book that, do not read this book if you are not willing to look at your negative thought patterns, because you have to address that in order to get over fatigue as a whole. And oftentimes, if you're so fatigued, you can't even think about that step. You just come back to it later. And then the last thing that I'll talk about is allergies and food. So, any allergic response that you can have to something, whether it's food or inhaled, can cause the immune system to get inflamed and reactive, causes inflammation, which in turn triggers the adrenal gland to produce more cortisol, because cortisol is our main anti-inflammatory, right? Cortisol gets converted to cortisone. Cortisone is used for injections in the joints, as well as prednisone comes from this, right? So they all come from cortisol, which is our main anti-inflammatory. And so when the immune system's out of control, you have increased inflammation, and then you have to use up then your cortisol, and then you get adrenal fatigue. But in terms of foods, so the most important thing that you could probably do for your health right now, if you take nothing else away from this talk, it's to not eat gluten. So gluten is amazingly toxic on so many different levels. I tell people it's like eating a sock.
Yeah.
Because it's been so hybridized, it's been so changed over the years. Every time we eat it, it damages our intestines, it causes leaky gut, it produces these morphines, which make us crave it more. It's just no good. And so,
So do this for me. So, as we talk to women who are, 50 and over, this is a question. It's like, is this a trend, right? And am I just following a fad?
Right.
Or, is this a real thing? It's the question of the century. But talk to us about all of the sources gluten hides, Dr. Evan.
All the sources that it hides in?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got wheat, and then you've got other grains. Then you also have soy sauce. And I shouldn't say all other grains, but most of the other grains besides like rice and millet, quinoa, those are safe. But you've got gluten, and you have spelt, and you have amaranth is generally okay, but barley is not. I could definitely share with you some resources on, what has gluten in it. But soy sauce, oftentimes natural flavors can have gluten in there. Carrageenan, but it also has MSG in there, glutamate, which is a whole nother issue. But those are kind of the big ones. And so getting back to a meat and veggies sort of paleo diet is what I recommend. And it's definitely different for everybody, but that's the base that I like for people. It's also going to be different, if you're working out, if you're going through one of Deborah's programs. But you just have to remove those barriers to being the best you that you can be.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, and I'll take up on that. I'll follow up, and we'll include some of those resources in the show notes, because I know that a lot of us listening, you're exploring, gluten can be a trigger for some people, but Dr. Evan, I love that you've just said, really for all of us, it's something to observe.
Yeah, absolutely. And even the people who aren't affected by it, you don't feel anything when you consume it. It's still damaging your intestines. So that's the perfect counter to the husband who says, I feel fine. Right. They still, the whole family needs to be on this diet, and you'll just see amazing things. The kids doing so much better in school, better behavior, better focus, less rashes, less autoimmune disease, less fatigue. It's really amazing.
Love it. I love that. So now we've answered diet is so important in fatigue. Anything else aside from gluten that we should be aware of? And mercury, heavy metals, but
Yeah, you mean in terms of food?
Yes.
Yeah, so I have a list, generally I'll take people through, kind of a detox or the food elimination diet where I remove the top 10 foods for 21 days and then we add one food back in every 4 days, and you can pretty much have a gluten party at that point and see how you react. That's always it's always a really good test to determine what's going on, because after 21 days the immune system is kind of primed for being more reactive.
So then, yes, you have the gluten party and the gluten hangover both, right?
Exactly. But I'll look at, besides gluten, dairy, soy, corn, citrus, caffeine, chocolate, alcohol. I'm missing a couple things, but those are kind of the main ones. All of your favorite foods. If you have a food on that list that is your favorite food in the world, you're probably sensitive to it.
Right. Oh, I know that. Yep. For me, it was peanut butter. Yep.
Yeah. There you go. Peanuts. I forgot about peanuts. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Peanut butter and I had to break up. Okay. So tell us two things. Number one, you mentioned, we've given a lot of great information. You've shared, a lot of things to be aware of now. With greater awareness, how can they get more of you, and or how do they find somebody who can help them? Because that's a struggle for a lot of people. They know something's wrong, but they're not getting the help that they want or need.
Absolutely. So, first thing, in terms of working with me, I'm pretty full at the clinic, but you can purchase my book on Amazon. It's for pre-sale right now. The full version will be out, or it'll be delivered in April. But please purchase that. It's got all this information in it.
And what's the title of that?
It's called Fix Your Fatigue.
Okay.
And that's also the name of my business, fixyourfatigue.org.
Okay, great.
And then to find a doc like me, I've kind of put together my own curriculum based off the holes, based off of the things that I've learned. But, looking at functionalmedicine.org is a great way to find a functional medicine physician.
Great. Okay.
That's a great place to start. There's also American Academy of Environmental Medicine, which is aaemonline.org.
Got it. Okay.
And then there's acam.org, which is American College for the Advancement of Medicine. That's acam.org. Okay. And they're practicing more integrative medicine, and they really specialize in the heavy metals and the chelation.
Great. Okay.
And then there's holisticmedicine.org, and those are doctors who are doing holistic medicine. And so there's a little bit of a difference between holistic, integrative, and functional, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, basically look for somebody who's in your area who can provide this sort of service to you, and you're going to be a lot better off than where you were before.
Fantastic. Dr. Evan, you've given so much great information. I would just want to make sure, listeners, you can get in touch with Dr. Evan and follow him at fixyourfatigue.org. And I'll list all of these resources that he's given us in the show notes, so you can go and grab those. And if you have a question, leave it below the show link at flipping50.com and join us on the Facebook fan page at Flipping50TV. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a rating in iTunes. It really helps. And then share this with a friend so you can surround yourself with a supportive group of women who are on the same journey. What are you waiting for? Start Flipping 50 today. Dr. Evan, thank you so much for the wealth of information.
Deborah, thanks so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Great.